My name is Ruth Ray. I was born in Edna, Texas, into a family whose roots were in Coahuila before the Texas Revolution. That's to Coahuila, Mexico. This was the background of my father. My mother came from Forney, Texas, near Dallas. Her father was an immigrant with his nine siblings and parents from Tiverton, Devon, England. Both parents were raised in the Methodist Church South, and we were also. The church, Epworth League, and MYF and Mount Wesley were very much a part of my years of growing up. At one time, I intended to be a missionary to India. I can remember doing that in high school and talking about all this stuff I was going to do, and I was really pretty high on myself. However, after Edna High School, Wharton County Junior College, I finished college at Southwestern University in Georgetown, which has always been my intention.
Okay. My name is Joseph M. Ray, and my parents were Tracy and Moody Ray. They were both raised as Methodist in the ME Church South, as we used to say. My church home in Dallas was the Maple Avenue Methodist Church. I was baptized by Paul E. Martin, who later became a bishop of the church. I would say parenthetically, I never met Paul Martin until I was a student at Southwestern, and he came as one of the bishop in residence in Texas to help dedicate the Perkins Chapel, which had been donated basically by the Perkins of Wichita Falls. And the context there was that Bishop Martin had been the pastor of the Perkins in Wichita Falls, and that was the reason he was present. But that was my first meeting with him. I was educated in the Dallas Public Schools, graduated from Crozier Technical High School, and from the age of 15, I knew that God wanted me to be a preacher. Our pastor was talking about his experience of being called into the ministry, and as he was talking, there came a voice to me that I did not know the source of that said, "That means you too." And I sort of dismissed it and continued to listen to the preacher, what he was saying. I happened to be sitting in the choir loft. And in a minute, the voice came again, "That means you too." So I took this as God saying to me, "Look, you need to be a United Methodist preacher." We were not the United Methodist Church then, but that was my call. And I went home and told my folks about this. And a very interesting thing happened. They just looked at each other sort of like, I thought, well, that's sort of interesting to me. I don't understand why they didn't say too much, but they said very little to me about that experience until about 12 years later. I was already through seminary. We were in about our third appointment, I think, and they came to visit us one weekend. So they brought up the subject. "Do you remember when you came home and said you wanted to be a preacher?" I said, "I sure do." "Do you remember that we didn't say anything?" I said, "Yeah, I sure do." I said, "I've always wondered about that." I said, "Well," "it's something real personal with us." I said, "We'd had your sister, and she had died after living for 6 hours, and we said before you were ever born, not knowing what we were going to have, we said to God, God, whoever you send us, he or she is yours, and you may do with him whatever you wish." And so we weren't surprised when you came home and said what you thought. Well, that's sort of interesting. Anyway, they accepted, and we talked a little bit more about it on that occasion, which was sort of interesting to me because I'd always wondered why they'd stayed real quiet about my call to the ministry. So, getting on to Southwestern, that's where Ruth and I met, and I need to talk about our first meeting. In order to do that, I need to talk about how I came to know her. It was the season before Christmas in the year 1950, and all of the social organizations participate in what's called the Christmas Sing, and they participate by getting ready, each of them doing some pretty good stuff for the sing, with each organization presenting. Well, I'd been a part of the Methodist, not the Methodist, but a part of the Independent Men's Organization, and I'd been over in the Student Union building practicing for the Christmas sing that we were going to do, and came back to the men's dorm, Mood Hall, and the 5U sorority, of which Ruth was a member, were serenading the boys, which happened sort of frequently. The sororities would come in one at a time and do a sing for the boys. Now, Mood Hall had an interesting configuration. It had an atrium, and it was covered over, had been open at one time, but the roof had been covered, and there was verandas around on all 3 floors. The building was built in 1908, so the boys would gather out on the veranda on all 3 levels. I came in from having been at our practice and just leaned up against one of the columns and started looking at all the girls. And while viewing the 5U sorority, I happened to spot this girl.
With black hair.
Really, yeah, with black hair. And once again, there was a voice that welled up within me. It wasn't God talking this time. It was me talking to myself. That's the girl I'm going to marry. That was a decision I made that night, not even knowing her name. That was just before Christmas. When Christmas holidays were over, I came back and immediately started a search among my friends and associates, trying to find out who in the world this girl was. And I visited with a man that I knew pretty well, a student I knew pretty well, a guy named Les Lovell, who later was in our wedding. And he first identified the girl that was Ruth's roommate. Said, "You must be talking about Joyce Brown." And he pointed her out to me. I said, "No, that's not the one I'm talking about." So later I said, "But she also is a brunette." "Oh," he said, "you must be talking about Ruth Simons." I said, "Oh, is that her name?" "Yeah." Well, anyway, discovering what her name was, I called her up that week and invited her to go to church with me on Sunday night at First Methodist Church. So on January 7th, 1951, we had our first date. And everything developed from then forward. And 1952, and September the 6th, we were married.
Let me say that after marrying and spending more than 40 years as the wife of a Methodist preacher and living in small towns, county seat towns, and a city, I can look back at the wonderful friends and persons in the congregations of some 9 appointments in churches, with some of those having another church as a preaching point, and a 6-year appointment which Joe served as a district superintendent. We think of each of those churches with their caring members and helpful ways with our 4 children. They were good to our children and nurtured them in many ways. It's been a great journey, and after retirement, Joe came to New Braunfels to spend 7 years working with Fred Martin and John Lowry. Another 2 years with Fred Martin at his invitation, and then another 2 years, or 2 years of that was spent with John Lowry. And then I said, "Isn't there something else you want to do in this life?" He said, "I guess I could quit." It was time for us to spend the opportunities that we had to visit with grandchildren in East Texas when they had occasion to be involved in extracurricular activities.
I'll take us back following the graduation from seminary and our moves, and I'll start with some of the churches. I think I want to stop after maybe the first two, but we'll talk about that later. After graduation in 1954, we were appointed to the Methodist Church in Combs, Texas. Combs is a small town north of Harlingen, about 5 miles. It was populated by farmers and good people who helped to run the community and that sort of thing. It was interesting that I got introduced to the Methodist system very quickly because our first Sunday, I discovered that the district superintendent was going to come on Sunday evening and hold a conference. And I had no idea at that point exactly what the conference was going to be about. But I did have a conversation with him and discovered that what had happened was that Combs and a church to the west of Combs by the name of Primera, which in Spanish means first, had been on a circuit together. And in about 3 years prior to our coming to Combs, the Combs church has gone as a single church, and the pastor, they'd had their first pastor that did not also serve in Primera, and Primera had had a pastor. The superintendent had decided to put the two congregations together, and that's what took place on the first Sunday night of my pastorate in Combs, Texas. The district superintendent came, and the two congregations were put into one. Now, put that in this particular part of the talk because it's right at the very first of my ministry, all of which is to say you never know exactly what is going to transpire in a given ministry, but that almost in every congregation in which we have served, there's been more than one congregation involved. So the folks in Primera were wonderful people. They did a great job and they added a great deal to the church. I don't know what the church would have been like if I had just Combs people there, but I'm sure glad we had the two congregations in one when I was there as pastor.
Did they come to your church building at Combs?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they did. They came, and that's one of the things I wanted to share. The building at Primera was a wonderful building, excellent, in fact, larger than what we had in Combs at that time. And it had been left, obviously, vacant. Almost immediately, conversation began between the McAllen district and the Rio Grande Conference of the United Methodist Church, which was the Hispanic Conference. And it was decided that we would turn the church property in Primera over to the Rio Grande Conference, and they provided a retired Methodist pastor who had been a superintendent and a number of other things, and he came along with his family and served in that church, which had been the Primera church. And I want to talk about how important that was because it impinged, and of course our ministries joined together in lots of ways. Sort of exciting because here we were one church, and yet we were also assisting the church in Primera of the Rio Grande Conference. Our board, which I want to applaud, almost immediately said, well, let's participate in their getting underway. we'll commit $600 toward the pastor's salary. Well, that really pleased the superintendent. As a person who became a superintendent later, I understood now how important that $600 was, because I don't think the Rio Grande superintendent had an idea one how he was going to pay the salary. He was going to let this retired preacher sort of live on his retirement. But it was good. The churches did work together, and it was very helpful. Now, I want to share an incident out of the Combs Church, which made...
Just a minute, Joe. Why don't you talk about just a minute about the conference this year? You're going to be joining with the Rio Grande Conference.
Oh, yeah. I can do that. Ruth, a good... you all need to know that this year the two conferences are going to be joined together, and a new name has been selected. We've been the Southwest Texas Conference, which has been basically the Anglo Conference, and the Rio Grande Conference, which has been basically the Hispanic Conference. The Rio Grande Conference has covered all of Texas and New Mexico, the Hispanic population. We will become a conference within bounds that are roughly what the Southwest Texas Conference have been, and we're going to go under the name Rio Texas.
Really?
So we will no longer be Southwest Texas, but that's all in the mix right now. The annual conference will become a merged annual conference, and we will be made up of both Anglos and Hispanics. Now I want to go back and...
I want to say one.
Okay.
I want to make one little
You say
comment,
more.
and then we'll go back to you.
Okay.
He's already talked about the fact that our first appointment was at Combs, just outside of Harlingen. They had a new parsonage that had been built mainly by the lay people, and it was a nice home. I have a picture of that, but I didn't bring it, but maybe someday I'll bring it up here. The house was adequate and nice. There was one room that had not been finished. The house sat in the middle of a field with a grapefruit orchard behind us. I didn't realize how wonderful that was at the time. North of us was a field of lettuce, and regularly we had a plane fly over early in the morning dusting the lettuce with DDT. And a house was no air conditioned, did not have air conditioning and open windows. So no telling what happened to me with the DDT, my kids. The one room that was not finished had been secured with a board, so we weren't supposed to open it. But we didn't think there was anything wrong with that, so we did open it. Several nights later, a big rat appeared in our chest of drawers, and Joe and I spent several hours chasing it with a broom in the middle of the night. We had moved from Dallas and been in dorms and things for several years. We just didn't realize that those things existed in us, in our field in the Rio Grande Valley. We had moved from Dallas in a moving van, since Joe had a big upright piano, but later, when we moved to our next appointment, shorts, we moved in a cotton trailer provided with one of our laymen in the Combs Church. Now Joe will go back and tell his story, which is important.
Yeah. The thing I wanted to share is how important the Hispanic congregation became to us, and particularly the Hispanic pastor. We had a gentleman who had moved to the valley from Iowa, which wasn't unusual. A lot of winter Texans do sometimes move to the valley. And this gentleman had bought one of the local grocery stores. There were two others. But this one was next door to the post office. It's the one we used most frequently. So I made friends with the new owner, and we got along famously. He came and joined the church, and I thought, that's really great. One day he surprised me by saying, and this man was about 50 years of age, he surprised me saying, well, I'm going to go to Mexico and get my wife. I said, you are? Because I'd never heard about a wife. But he said yes. So he came, he went, and after a week or so, he was back and had a pretty young woman, about age 20 or so, and they had a little boy. His name was Joe, and this baby was little Joe. Interestingly, after about 6 months or so, I know little Joe was past 6 months anyway, he became ill and died. And I was down trying to minister to the family, and you can imagine the wife was beside herself. I knew no Spanish, and the gentleman knew no Spanish either, and we both were having a difficult time dealing with her because she obviously was tremendously upset. So the husband said to me, "Why don't you go get Reverend Murata and see if he would help us?" So I got in the car immediately and went over to Primera, told Brother Murata what was going on, and brought him back with me to the little part of the store that was in the back of the store where they lived. And I got to witness his ministering to this woman and in her grief. And it was a kind of formal thing that I had never witnessed, but I discovered that this was what the Hispanics do. He got a chair, he went over and very gently picked up this young mother. He went over and put her down in the chair, and then he stood back and buttoned his coat and stood there and proceeded to give a little homily of a sort. Now, I could not understand much Spanish, but I understood exactly what he was doing. What he was saying to her was, "You don't have to worry about the destiny of this baby. God has already received this baby into his arms, and little Joe is in the arms of our Savior." And all of this hysteria suddenly came to an end. She got control of herself, and things went very, very calmly. And she was very grateful, and I was very grateful. I took Brother Murata home and talked to him about him. I said, "Tell me, is this what you were saying?" He said, "That's about it, you know." And so that's how I knew sort of what he'd said, because I asked him to debrief with me just a little bit. I went back and visited with the family some more, and they spent a day or so making arrangements. And in a couple of days, it was decided that they would take little Joe back to Iowa, where he would be buried with the older Joe's relatives. He asked me if I would come and visit with them before they left on their trip to Iowa. I said, "Of course I will." And so I went, and I had prayer with them and wished them Godspeed. Helped them load the casket in the back end of the car. I couldn't understand how this woman was going to take this, driving with a casket of her child in the back seat all the way to Iowa, where the funeral was to take place. But that trip happened, and they got back safely, and I was really pleased that things went as well as it did. I think maybe better stop right now and let you talk some more.
60 years ago, in June of 1954, we started as a new pastor and wife in Combs. Our oldest child was 10 months old. At that time, when we received a new appointment, many times it was not known until the pastor was at conference in San Antonio. We used to talk about going to Jerusalem. We called going to San Antonio, Jerusalem. And the bishop and the 6 district superintendents would work on the 2nd floor of the St. Anthony Hotel. And those of the preachers that could afford it would stay there. The rest of us would go sit in the lobby and watch all the proceedings. It was an outstanding hotel, and we were all very fascinated with the fact that if you walked through the door, there was a light beam of light that would open the door for you. Now, I don't know if you all were ever down there in the years of the heyday of the St. Anthony, but it was very, very, to small town people like me, I just thought that was really, that was a new hotel. Preachers and laypersons, as well as their wives, were not shopping. We were not shopping at Joski's. We sit in the lobby watching for a runner to come and beckon to a pastor to come up to the second floor. It was an entertaining way to spend the break time from conference preaching and business sessions. Our bishop, A. Frank Smith, was the one we will always think of as a bishop. He had thick white hair and balding and a great smile with a good sense of humor. He told all the preachers and their wives, and it was wives then. We had no, we did not have any.
No women clergy.
No women clergy, and certainly they didn't have any spouses. So anyway, he would tell us that we need to each couple needed to have, preacher couple needed to have 4 children to be able to outborn the Catholics. So we did that, and later on the others didn't do it. I mean, they didn't keep up with that. He lived in Houston. He was the bishop over the Southwest Texas Conference and the Texas Conference, which had Houston as its episcopal base. Bishop Smith lived in Houston, only came to San Antonio, and maybe for the dedication of a church, and probably to preach at one of the high steeple churches at some time. When the appointments were made in those days, 3 or 4 days after the conference, at the end of the conference, they were read to those at the conference on Sunday afternoon. Sometimes even before they had the reading, a runner might get the attention of a pastor in the sanctuary and do this. And he would follow him up to the St. Anthony and up to the second floor. Something had fallen apart in their apartment making. When the appointment was made on Sunday, the pastor and his family needed to be at the next church and parsonage by Thursday. And that means that parsonage needed to be ready to receive the new family. And that was hard. Sometimes also on the appointments were made on Sunday afternoon. Later that afternoon, or that evening, after the conference was over, Methodist families, ours included, my parents, would gather around the radio and listen to someone read the appointments on WOAI. That was really important in those days. I mean, people would listen to the radio to find out where the Methodist preachers were going. Before the days of cell phones or having a long-distance call for the announcement of the coming pastor, many members would not get that word unless they had that word from over the radio at that time until they made the other announcements later on.
That's amazing. I never thought of that.
And,
Wow.
And this all happened in about the first 20 years. Later on, they started making appointments like they do now, earlier in the spring, giving them more time. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't teaching school at that time, but after I started teaching school, we did have more time. Otherwise, I'd be in school about the time we had to move, and that would have been hard. You want to talk about Dr. Curl and E.E. Reeves?
Yes. Some of you know Elvin Reeves. I think he and Maddie attended here some. He and I had been in Southwestern together, so we often would have conversation at annual conference. And I was having a conversation with him in the St. Anthony one day when all of a sudden one of these runners that Ruth has talked about came off the elevator, having been upstairs where the cabinet was meeting, and pointed to Elvin and said, Elvin says, "What? Me?" He wasn't planning on moving. And the runner assured him it was him that they wanted to see. So Elvin went off to visit with the cabinet, and I stayed around to see what the results was because I wanted to know where in the world they were going to send Elvin. So he came back after about 25 minutes, and I said, Elvin, where are you going? He said, well, they want me to go to Grenada. I said, Grenada? That's right close to Ruth's hometown. Yeah, I know. And I said, well, are you going? He said, well, I guess I am. I said to Dr. Curl, well, can I say no? And Dr. Curl said, well, yes, you can. But remember, there's a hereafter. And that was sort of the attitude that the superintendents had in those days. If you didn't agree to go, just remember, they're not going to knock on your door very soon the next time around.
Mm.
So Elvin went to Grenada, and he did what they asked him to do there. They sent him there to build a new church building. And every time I see the church building in Grenada, now I think about that meeting in the lobby of St. Anthony Hotel. Where are you going? Well, they want me to go to Grenada. So
I need to say this about Dr. Curl. His name was Floyd Curl. If you've been to the Methodist Center over there, Methodist
Hospital.
hospital.
There were the streets that go into that area, and Dr. Curl was his name for him, and he was very much the mover and pusher for getting the hospital out where it is.
Mm-hmm.
And when he first approached the laymen and some other people, they, well, nobody's going to go out there to that hospital, but they built the hospital, and he did. And I remember being there when they broke ground. Joe had a funeral that day, but it was during conference, broke ground, and they started talking about these microwaves they were going to have in the rooms to have the fixed lunches and everything in the dining rooms, the kitchens. And that was really something. That was in 1960, and that was really, or 61, really an important thing. So times have changed in the later years, and that's changed with the appointments too. I mean, people have more opportunity to say no. Wives of pastors usually are working, children in high school and other reasons have helped the pastor stay in an appointment or move at a time that was better for the family without having to worry. When the appointment was made on Sunday, the pastor and family needed to be at the next church in the parsonage. So when we moved, we had to really push all that stuff together and put them in those boxes. And sometimes we carried those boxes around for years without ever opening them. We moved from Big Lake to Yoakum on a hot June day, from dry Big Lake to hot and humid Yoakum. The Monday that we moved, our younger daughter came down with a case of the mumps. We had a U-Haul, 2 cars loaded to the brim, and our mother, cat, and kittens to move. Joe, the U-Haul driver, and our boys went ahead of the girls, and yours truly had the task to clean up the parsonage, and the girls helped. What a task to get everything clean and then drive the long distance to Yoakum, which is about 250 miles. At each new church, the women of the WSCS or UMW later on would have food in the fridge, or some other ladies would bring in their dishes. We always felt welcome. Also in those early years, we'd be invited to the homes of the parishioners, even though we had 4 children. And that was really something for our family to invite us with 4 children. And they were wonderful people. Our children were preacher kids in every sense of the word. And our children were preacher kids in every sense of the word. They've all grown up to be law-abiding citizens, as far as I know. I know the influence of people in those various churches helped us start them in the right direction.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about moving the shirts
Yeah, okay.
and what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, we moved from combs to shirts. Now, you all know where shirts is, but we did not know that there was any place called shirts until the appointment was suggested to us by the superintendent and the bishop.
And that was Dr. Curl.
And that was Dr. Curl. And we had to look at a Texas map to find how we were going to go from combs to shirts, and that was fairly easy to do. But I remember our apprehension as we started down 78, having gone to Seguin and then turned left and started towards shirts, and just wondering, how long is it going to be before we get there, et cetera. Because we knew we were getting closer all the time. But one of the things that happened on the way to that particular meeting, I think you've talked about it.
Haven't said anything about the fact that the people would come over and help us move. I mean,
Yeah.
They would literally
So
help
you
put
need,
these
you
in
need to
boxes.
talk about that, because I was going to mention it.
And because I was barefoot and we had a number of people over there helping us and throwing things in boxes, they packed all my shoes.
Oh, oh dear.
And because Joe was kind of embarrassed to have me, we were going in a cotton trailer, we looked like gypsies. But anyway, I think he was embarrassed to take his wife to a new appointment without his shoes. So Joe decided that would not work, and so when we got to Beeville, he went to a penny store and seen a pair of kids in the window. He told the clerk that that's what he wanted, and they were my size, and he brought them out there.
I pointed the shoes that I wanted because I could sort of goggle them and notice that those shoes would fit Ruth, and they did. I mean, I took her pair of kids. She had some shoes to go, so she wasn't going to be barefooted when we got there.
I'll read one more sentence here.
Okay.
On our arrival at the parsonage next to the church building, and this is what's the church building that was next to this 2-bedroom, 1 bath, no storage space, had an old garage that was about to fall down. As our older son said one time, he patted the church on his, "This is my daddy's church." And he was about 2.5. But on our arrival, the lady across the street came across and said, "My name is Lucy Dean, and we're so glad to have you in our church." Mm-hmm. And we became very fast friends, and were friends until she died about 10 years ago. And you can read about this.
Okay. Okay, I'll just finish up a little bit about Schertz. The Schertz area was settled by Germans, and some of those folks were relatives of John Dare, who is in our congregation here. The names were Wiederstein, Tolley, Gable, and Wiest. And John was related in some way to each one of those families. I've never quite figured it all out.
Well, his mother was a Tolley.
His mother was a Tolley. That's one of the...
And I think a sister to Richard.
Yeah.
Richard Tolley was the treasurer of this church, and he was very, very tight with the money, and been for a long time, and so they called him Dollar Tolley.
Yeah, Richard was a good treasurer and very, very precise with the money. So we didn't lose any money with him in control.
But when he would get up to make the treasurer report at the board meeting, he would say, "We have so many dollar." So that's where he got the name.
We called him Dollar Tolley. As most of us here would know, by the time we arrived in Schertz, it had been had an airfield adjacent to it. It was very important in the life of our country. We were very fortunate to have all of the service personnel that would come through Randolph in one way or another, in some time or another, and choose to come to the local church rather than go to the base chapel. I had a good relationship all the time I was in church with the chaplains on base. I remember saying to the chief chaplain when I first moved there, I said, "Well, anytime I can help you, let me know." And he was out of the Lutheran tradition, I think, and he said, "Anybody on the base, I'll take care of them. Anybody off the base, you can take care of them." So I understood where my boundary was. So I did take care of the folks that cared to come to the Methodist Church, which was a good experience. Now, I've said that there are always two churches, or a lot of times in our experience, there are two churches. One of the things that took place while we were serving the Schertz Church, was that Universal City began to grow. We were there when they started with the initial sort of housing development in a place called Rose Garden, and the Schertz Independent School District built a school building in Rose Garden to take care of that community, and it was growing. So it was pretty obvious to me that we were going to need to have some sort of outreach to the Universal City community, and we did a lot of talking. Fortunately, Ruth, who had been trained in Christian education at Southwestern, said, "Why don't we start an extension Sunday school in Universal City?" So that's what we did. We recruited a person for young people, a person for children, and I went to teach the adults. And so for a year and a half, 18 months or something like that, the last 18 months of our time in church, I was beginning every Sunday after the first service in church, driving over to Universal City and teaching an adult Sunday school class, then driving back and finishing up there. So that was a wonderful experience. We had the privilege, Ruth and I did, last fall, it was fall, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Of attending the 50th anniversary of the organization of the Universal City United Methodist Church. And
Actually, it was in April.
Well, it was, okay. It was in the spring
Right.
last year. The pastor who had actually organized it was the gentleman who came after us in church, but he now deceased, so these folks like to continue to call us, sort of their originator. Well, we were in a sense, but I was not the pastor there when it was formed as a church. But we were invited back for the anniversary and enjoyed being a part of it. So the ministry of the church congregation got extended a little bit, and that was helpful. I will say how we started the Sunday school. I took the MYF members and we created a circular, and we took the members of the MYF and went throughout the area north of Randolph Air Force Base, which basically out Pat Booker Road. And every house we could find, the young people delivered a circle. There were some mobile trailer parks, which is not unusual still, I think, along that particular stretch of Pat Booker that were there. And some of our young people thought, well, we'll make short work of this, and they just started stuffing the circulars in the mailboxes. It wasn't too long, in fact, about a day after that happened, when I had a call from the local post office in church wanting to know what we were doing, stuffing stuff in their boxes. And I apologized. I said, "Oh, I did not know they were doing that." I said, "You have to forgive our young people. They just thought that'd be an easy way to get the circulars distributed, etc." Anyway, I talked our way out of being prosecuted for misusing government property.
I think we probably need to stop at this point. We have, too many other churches and too much other things that were done. But these are kind of this is kind of a understanding about what it was like 40 years ago, 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. Yes, thank you.